My name is Richard Bernal. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Global Affairs, and my pleasant task this morning includes welcoming you to the regional headquarters of the University of the West Indies here in Kingston, Jamaica. I also extend a warm welcome to those who are joining us by live stream and through UWI TV. This morning, among my other duties, I'm going to do a number of things which will make it unnecessary for the subsequent speakers to do them. So I'm going to just clear the way for those who come after me. I know those are famous last words among those people who said, "They who come after me will answer," lost their heads, but I will not be in that position this morning. First of all, let me acknowledge and say how pleased we are to have with us, to lead us off this morning in the program, our Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. If I was to regale you with the details of his CV, we wouldn't have time for the seminar. So he has graciously allowed me to say that you are all well, he's well known to you all. I'm going to welcome in his absence, because I know he's on the way, former Prime Minister Bruce Golding. I welcome also you have arrived just in time. They say in politics, timing is all. You haven't lost your touch, obviously. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, I can see that the High Commissioner of Trinidad and Tobago is here, as he always is, to support us. I welcome PVCs, both those who are here, Pro Vice Chancellors, and those who are coming later. I particularly want to single out my good friend and colleague, Professor Kawa, the Deputy Principal of the Mona campus. I see we have with us the former principal of the Mona campus, Ambassador Professor Gordon Shirley. Welcome. I also want to extend a very special acknowledgement to members of the Lewis family. We have with us Professor W. Richard Jacobs, a well-known Caribbean scholar and policymaker. We're very happy you are here joining us today. And we have also the grandniece of Sir Arthur Lewis, who is here. She's the director of the British Council here in Jamaica, Ms. Jacobs Bonnick. Thank you for being here. I welcome the panelists. I thank them for readily accepting the invitation. I also thank those whose arms were twisted successfully, but happily so. I see that we're joined by the private sector. Representing the private sector organization of Jamaica is the head of Citibank. We always like to have the private sector with us. Faculty, staff, students, both UWI students and I presume prospective UWI students from high schools. Media, thank you for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, welcome again. Many of us, especially those younger ones among us, are not really familiar with Sir Arthur Lewis. And to save the panelists from having to introduce him, I'm going to introduce to you Sir Arthur Lewis. As you know, this seminar is mounted by the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies, and the director is here. I know how much work yourself and Dr. Leslie put into this. We thank you for doing this. It's an idea which originated with the Vice Chancellor, and it fits most appropriately with our celebrations of the 70th anniversary of the start of the University of the West Indies. Sir Arthur Lewis was born in St. Lucia in 1915. He finished school at 14, and he had to wait several years before he would be old enough to go to university. But he won the single scholarship to university from St. Lucia, went to the London School of Economics, got a first-class honors in a Bachelor of Science and Commerce in 1937, and a PhD in Industrial Economics from the London School of Economics in 1940. He was so good that he was immediately offered a lectureship at that university, where he taught from 1940 to 1948. He then became professor at the age of 33 at the University of Manchester, and his stint there, 1948 to 1957, was where he produced some of his seminal articles. He was economic advisor to the newly independent country of Ghana, 1957 to 1959, Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, 1959 to 63. He was knighted in 1963 and became professor at Princeton University in the same year. He took a leave of absence there to become the first president of the Caribbean Development Bank, 1970 to 73. And in 1973, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Science. He was the first person from the English-speaking Caribbean to achieve a Nobel Prize. He retired from Princeton in 1983, although he continued to have rooms there. Later in the program, you will hear much more of three aspects of his work. First of all, a pioneer in development economics. It's a tribute to him that he wrote an article in 1954, which is still required reading on any development economics course taught anywhere in the world. He was also an anti-colonial activist. He challenged the colonial authorities' view that the Caribbean could only produce primary products and export them in their unrefined state. He had a long debate and had the audacity to suggest industrialization, and not only industrialization, but export industrialization. He was also a policymaker. He served in Ghana, he served at the Caribbean Development Bank, and at the University of the West Indies. We have to close. I just want to introduce you to the program. We have assembled, I think, the cream of the crop of people who have been studying the work of Arthur Lewis. Some will be joining us by Zoom, such as Professor Carrie Levitt, Professor Tignor, and Professor Compton Bourne, also a former Pro-Vice Chancellor at the University of the West Indies. We thank them for that, and I think you're already seeing them on screen. We thank all of the panelists who will be introduced by their respective moderators. And it is only left for me to introduce the moderators. Our first moderator is Dr. Wesley Hughes, longtime friend, co-author, and head of numerous important agencies in the government of Jamaica. And he's still with us, which is remarkable, having been the director of the Planning Institute and the financial secretary. Those two jobs usually finish off people, but he has had both. And he's alive and well and here with us. Michael Witter, when I joined the Department of Economics in 1979, he was already there. He served with great distinction for over 30 years, and I don't see him, but I hope he's going to appear just in time. So they will then introduce the panelists. In closing, let me say that I had the great pleasure of meeting Sir Arthur Lewis. I was doing research for my doctoral thesis at Princeton University, and I had the temerity to go over and ask for an appointment, and he was very gracious. He saw me and spent an hour with me, and that was a defining experience for me. So a very gracious, humble, modest man, despite all of these achievements. Now, you have had the light refreshment of today's food for thought. Now we're going to start with the substantive matters, and I'm going to invite to the podium our Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles.
Thank you so much, PVC. Very good morning, everyone. The protocol has been observed, but I'm sure that PVC Bernal would allow me to recognize my very first head of department when I joined the history department 39 years ago, Professor Carol Watson, Professor Carol Campbell. Carol, good morning. And Professor Roy O'Jay, who mentored us all over several generations. It's good to see you. It's good to see you both. When I came to Mona 39 years ago, my task was to teach Caribbean economic history. And nicely, I taught from around 1400, which captured the Amerindian economy, right through to 1945. After 45, it transitioned over to another course over in the economics department, which was called CEP, Caribbean Economic Problems. Some of you probably don't remember that. That was a long time ago. You taught that, Wesley? Yes. And occasionally I would go over from the history department over to the economics department to do seminars in Caribbean economic problems. But in those days, we recognized that Sir Arthur was the economic historian, economist, straddling these disciplines in search of an understanding of what development ought to be. In those days, one would say that the Department of History and the Department of Economics were very robust and aggressive departments in this search for understanding the constraints and the challenges of economic transformation, social change. It was a remarkable time in the history of the university. The conversations were robust. Later, when I transferred to the Cayfield campus in '84, Sir Arthur was in residence at Cayfield. Neville, you recall, he had an office in your faculty when you were dean. And occasionally, I would join him in a walk from the Faculty of Social Sciences to the staff canteen, and we would sit quietly in a corner and discuss economic development and transformation. But I had encountered him much earlier because as an undergraduate in economic history in a British university, his work was central to our curriculum. So I became aware of Sir Arthur Lewis's work as an undergraduate in the UK, where he was celebrated and where his work was germane to any discussion about economic development, not only in Britain, but in Europe and in the wider world. So I had a long engagement with him over time. He would speak occasionally about the turbulence of his Mona years. And those were interesting years because there was tremendous anxiety about the need to transform these economies, to achieve economic growth, to build competitive industries, to find at least a price competitiveness for our commodities. And these were the areas that concerned him. Fortunately for us, he has spawned a generation of economists who were critical of his work and who sought to domesticate it and identify the depth of its relevance. It's hard to imagine, even now, that Beckford's Persistent Poverty was published 46 years ago, which was in many ways a response to Arthur Lewis. That we need to examine structures, the structures of our economies, the historical structures of them, the institutions, the value systems. And the notion, which unfortunately I thought was misunderstood then, when Sir Arthur was talking about economic transformation with unlimited supplies of labor, and the ways in which to attract foreign direct investment, to soak up the labor which was being released by the plantation systems of the Caribbean. As the plantation systems were decaying and collapsing, releasing the labor, we needed to attract capital to soak up this labor, and at the same time, create modern sectors using technology to upgrade the human stock. And I thought Sir Arthur understood the totality of it. But there were elements of it I thought that was subject to misunderstanding. The notion of unlimited supplies of labor was occasionally politically interpreted as unlimited supplies of cheap labor, which was then again misunderstood. Unlimited supplies of cheap laborers, which became the center of a discourse about socialism and social justice. We are at the center of a rebirth of an aspect of Lewis' work that has gone under the radar for these 60, 70 years. In his little 1939 booklet, Labor in the West Indies, he was still a graduate student when he wrote that pamphlet, the Bourne Commission, Fabian Society encouraging him. There is a sentence in that book that has found revival, has gone quietly unnoticed for all of these years. And it became strikingly relevant, especially in the context of the director of the IMF, Mrs. Lagarde, who visited this campus a few weeks ago and made a fascinating statement that it seems that Jamaica and the Caribbean on the whole, that they have become economic growth resistant. Now that is a disturbing concept for all of the economics that we have been developing in this university, in this region for the better part of 70 years. Economic growth resistant, and suggesting that there might very well be socio-cultural reasons for this resistance, and locates the inhibitors to economic growth and transformation within the socio-cultural sector. That despite all of the money that has been poured into the economies of the region, the stabilization, IMF stabilizations for 30 years, despite all of that, we might have become economic growth resistant. But Lewis did say in 1939 that there is a matter that he said must be addressed, and it has not been addressed. He says, this 20 million pounds extracted by the British out of the Caribbean at emancipation, that reparations that was paid out of the Caribbean economy, it is a debt, he said, that Britain has to repay. And until it is repaid, we are going to have difficulties with economic growth. How that was ignored, and all the economists here, how that was ignored for 70 years is of interest to me. He went on to explain why this had to be addressed. Because the region needed a Marshall Plan. He spoke about the development plan for the region, decolonization requiring a development plan. He spoke at the Standing Closer Associations Conference in Montego Bay in 1948. He says there has to be a development plan for this region. In 1958, he repeated it on the Federation discourses. We've had 40 years of economic discourse about the need for this region to have a development plan at the end of the colonial period, without which decolonization and nation building would be subverted. And he was clear, it would be subverted. Those are conversations that I think the younger generations are now looking into. Because the issue of social expenditure, or the issue of governments overextending themselves in the social area, health, education, housing, water, roads, all of those areas for social citizenship, we have extended ourselves and we haven't cracked it. Those are areas he felt that should have been the subject of a development plan. I think we need to revisit that conversation, and I know that our panelists will be addressing the question as to whether we have become economic growth resistant, whether the political narrative has not engaged the economic understanding sufficiently close, and how the next generation of economists dealing with globalization, decolonization, nation building, and especially this second phase of nation building. But let me say something quickly before I go about this 20 million pounds. In 1834, it represented 40% of British public expenditure. The Parliament took 40% of public expenditure and gave it to the slave owners. At 40% of public expenditure in 1834, that would represent, in today's money, 200 billion pounds. In today's money, 200 billion pounds in today's money. If you take it in terms of national income, it would represent 76 billion pounds in today's money. How many people are aware that that money, which was borrowed from the Rothschilds Corporation, was only repaid 5 years ago? For all of these years, we assume that that 30-year bond would have been repaid to the Rothschilds by at least the 1870s. It was refinanced, it was refinanced. And so when the British Prime Minister came to our parliament in Jamaica and said, the slave economy is behind us, it's history, it's in the past, did he know at the time when he spoke in this parliament that the British government was still repaying the Rothschilds in 2015? And therefore, taxpayers of Great Britain were still settling the Caribbean matter, which makes it relevant today. So the argument that this is an economic issue in the past, relevant today. So we have some interesting research to do. We have some new economic thinking to look at. And I believe that those of us who are participating in the search for a new way of looking at Caribbean development, post-colonial development, in the second phase of nation building, in this second phase, we have to address the question of this debt that Lewis spoke very clearly about in 1939. It has to be re-injected into the Caribbean economy, and that is a political conversation that we must have. And it's going to be a global conversation. We are in the vanguard of it, but it's a global conversation. We have to re-inject that capital into the Caribbean economy. So, with those words, I just wish to say that we are all very proud of our university these past 70 years in our search for paradigms and models and concepts to facilitate economic transformation with social justice. And we have to emphasize the social justice because what we have seen from the Bourne report, the UNDP report, poverty continues to increase in this region. Inequality is galloping across the region. And with galloping inequality and poverty 56 years after independence, we cannot continue to speak simply about economic growth without speaking about social growth. is driving all of the problems we're having, Prime Minister, you know, the whole discourse on crime and so on. We have to get to the root of it. Welcome, and thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Vice Chancellor, there's a reason why I especially want to refer to Ambassador Bourne. He and I wrote this paper along with Norman Gervin. It was called IMF and Jamaica. And it's fairly popular. It was referred to very often as Gervin et al. So just, he's et and I'm al. Okay. Honorable former Prime Minister Golin, nice to see you here. Honorable ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct pleasure this morning to chair this first panel for this distinguished Caribbean scholar. I've had the pleasure of reading Sir Arthur Lewis's work, and I purchased some time ago the 3 volumes of his work. I spent most of my money on books over the years. But it was clear to me in reading that this wasn't just about development and economics, it's about literature. Because I've not seen an economist in a long time who was so prolific, so clear in his thought, logical, and very importantly, wide-ranging in the issues and subjects that he spoke about. The focus broadly was on development, trade, public policy, public administration, and very importantly, planning. And for good reasons, I spent a lot of time focused on his comments about planning and planners. He said one of the great misfortunes of his life is that he had to read some 50 development plans from across the British colonies because of where he was located in the British government at the time. But he had some very, very important comments to make about a lot of important subjects. And that's what we're going to be focused on this morning. And just before we start, I want to pose some questions because I would like, at the end of the day, that we think about these things. Is the work of Sir Arthur Lewis still relevant? Given the forces of globalization, the rapid and pervasive technological changes that we've seen, demographic changes, and the new geopolitical realities of today, are the insights and perspectives of Sir Arthur Lewis of the 1950s and the 1960s still relevant? Are the themes of growth of export, improving labor productivity by transferring surplus labor from the subsistence agricultural sector into manufacturing, solid and appropriate economic policies, efficient and non-corrupt public administration, rural development, sensible development planning from the bottom up? Are these still relevant themes today? These are some of the questions we should seek to answer. Have new and urgent issues forcing themselves on us, such as climate change, inequality, systemic institutional failures, and threats to human survival? Are those issues pushing some of the issues that were raised by Sir Arthur Lewis in talking about trade and investment and export growth in particular? Even if the problems are fundamentally different today, relevant question may be, are the approaches to research and scholarship and the insights that he brought still relevant? I would like to think that most of the answers will come out in the discussion today in one form or the other. It is my duty, and a pleasant one, to introduce our speakers. And we're going to change the batting order a little bit today. On your program, you'd have noticed that that Professor Mark Figueroa was going to be batting at number 2. Unfortunately, it's a limited over match, and we need someone to score some very quick runs at the end. So he has been shifted to bat at number 4. And the program will be first Professor Compton Bourne, who was one of my teachers at the university here. And I'm very honored to be introducing Professor Bourne. Of course, Professor Figueroa was also my teacher. He was one of my first tutors. Despite the similarity in age between himself and me, I did learn a lot from him. And of course, we have Dr. Northover, who will bat at number 2, and Dr. Brathwaite at number 3. So, ladies and gentlemen, my pleasure is to introduce first Professor Compton Bourne, who is a graduate of the University of London, University of Birmingham, and the University of the West Indies. He was president of the Caribbean Development Bank from 2001 to 2011, and the executive director of the Center for Monetary and Finance between 2012 and 2014. Professor Bourne is a well-known scholar and public servant across the Caribbean, and has been a most distinguished son of the region. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Bourne, who is going to be speaking to us. I'm not exactly sure whether it's Trinidad or Barbados. I'm not sure where he's located, but he's in outer space, so he will deliver his remarks from outer space. Professor Bourne, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wesley. Not in outer space. I'm in my modest study in Trinidad. I'm very pleased to have been invited to this forum by the Vice Chancellor and by Ambassador Bernal, both of whom have been colleagues and friends for a long time. The Vice Chancellor, in his remarks, made reference to the various things that Sir Arthur Lewis, this distinguished the Caribbean economist of St. Lucian birth, had said in earlier times. His work, his references to planning, his references to labor in the West Indies, and so on. What I want to do this morning is to look at how Sir Arthur saw the Caribbean development problem at a later stage, at the time when he was president of the Caribbean Development Bank, that is in the period 1970 to 1973. Because I think his depiction of the problems at the time have some resonance now, and we can, and also because as president of the bank, he had an opportunity, which he used quite well, to shape Caribbean economies and to help to influence their economic growth and development experience. Lewis, in his address to the bank annual meeting in 1972, had a very stark statement about the state of Caribbean economies. He said, to quote him, "Apart from minerals, our basic industries are in poor shape." And he went on to detail that in terms of agriculture and manufacturing in particular, and spoke about some possibilities emerging in tourism. He went on to say that our economies are not able to provide full, or we're able to say that the sad consequence of this relative stagnation in our economies is rising urban unemployment, which he recognizes the political significance of, but goes on to say that rising unemployment, particularly among the young, is an agonizing human problem, because so many of our young people, on leaving school, may tramp the streets for a whole year or two before finding their first jobs. Mr. Moderator, I would suggest that this is still very much the case. In fact, my report which I quoted on the criminal development of the year, on the criminal human development 2016, details this problem of unemployment and the fact that in many countries, youth unemployment is double that of the adult unemployment. And the data for Jamaica, I'm sure you're familiar with, shows the long transition between leaving school and finding a job. Now, Senator said that our economies are not able to provide full employment because our money costs of production are too high in relation to world prices. The crux of the problem for him is the ability to either export competitively or to compete with imports coming into the countries of the region. And he speaks of money money costs, as we shall see later, in terms of a variety of factors influencing the cost at which we produce. So Arthur is so convinced and concerned with the problem of unemployment that he actually sought to suggest that the region could achieve full employment in about a decade of time, which would imply fairly substantial rates of growth in annual employment. I myself, in 1987, in my work on Caribbean development in the year 2000, went so far as to suggest the kind of economic growth rate that might generate full employment. And suggesting that at that time, if the region grew at about 5 to 7% per year, it would make a significant dent on the employment problem. We know, of course, that no country in the region has sustained that kind of growth rate for very long periods of time, for a decade or more. He went on to say that since the situation is that our exchange rates, trade policies, money incomes, and productivity are mutually consistent, we can solve this problem, the unemployment problem, on a practical level if we operate on all four variables in mutual support. So Arthur, in his work, in that speech and elsewhere, speaks a lot about devaluation and makes the argument, which people didn't like, I remember in the late 1970s, that devaluation can help countries if the resulting rise in domestic costs is proportionately less than the fall in the exchange rate. But whether or not this will be the case, whether or not the rise in domestic costs is proportionally less than the devaluation, the foreign exchange rate, will depend on the level of community discipline. And that is where he had some big issues. And of course, we know because of the differential impact of exchange rate changes on different social groups, it is normally very difficult to arrive at a social consensus and a political consensus. But unless that is done, exchange rate changes might not help too much. On trade policy, Lewis draws on his extensive experience and makes the argument that the region should aim at not at becoming self-sufficient in terms of imports, as much as reducing the ratio of imports to income levels as the region grows. In other words, one cannot expect to replace imports totally, but one can reduce the significance of imports in the total basket of goods. He then, of course, places his greatest emphasis on the expansion of exports, and particularly the exports of manufacturers. He says that he recognizes the limitations or the weaknesses in agricultural exports, which we know are still with us. Lewis had made a remark that preferences might not be a lasting situation. Well, we know that has turned out to be the case. He makes the possibility that our agricultural production, because of its high costs of production, even for domestic supply, is not competitive. But he goes on to say that tourism has some possibilities. But he places his main emphasis on world trade in manufactures, the growth in that, which he thinks provides some space for the creation of a sizable export dynamic and growth dynamic for Caribbean countries. Lewis, as might be expected, spends quite a bit of his time on the question of productivity and about the scope which he believes exists for increasing productivity. In his view, our productivity problem, or the productive problem of the region at that time, was largely, as he says, deficiencies are partly of training, partly of organization, and partly of capital. The biggest training gap he saw was in relation to agriculture, where we had a farming community that was largely bereft of training. He, however, felt that if you trained people, then you also have to engage in complementary land reform, which will be aimed at increasing the sizes of farms. He makes a valid point that one cannot sustain the levels of living at the household level on the basis of 2 acres and 3 acres of land. As we know, land reform has not been a seller in the region. Even in situations where countries of the region have divested out of sugar, they have not been successful or approached the matter vigorously in terms of making larger acres of land available to the farmers. In manufacturing, he thought the training gap is largely occupational, the variety of skills that you require to support the manufacturing sector. And he sees this as a major cause of low productivity. Again, I myself, in the work in Caribbean development in the year 2000, in 1987, had pointed to the gap we have in our training and education system, where we do not produce enough people in the tech work field, to use modern parlance. Lewis shows a great degree of social consciousness too, in how he speaks about the waste of brain power. He says, it is clear that much of our finest brain power runs to waste. Now, Lewis here is not talking about emigration, though he does mention that later. He's talking about the class bias in our education system that prevents children from poor or low-income households from being able to take full advantage of education opportunities. A system that does not, did not at that time, cater very well to them. And we might ask whether it does now, or the extent to which it does. One can also raise productivity by employing more capital per head, he says. He thinks at that time that the required investment rate was 20% of GDP, and the financial sources for capital would be domestic savings and foreign capital. Lewis clarifies what has been a misconception, I believe, on this question of foreign capital. He says that the strategy of inviting foreign investment presupposed that the resulting increase in national income would provide opportunity for sharp increases in the ratio of domestic savings, and thereby allow the region to become more financially self-sufficient and ultimately maybe buy out some of the foreign capitalists. This did not happen, he says, because, and I quote him, in so far as personal consumption goes, we are still a thriftless people. And he goes on to say our governments are just as spendthrift as our people. This question of domestic savings rate is of course central to a lot of development financing. And I think at various points in time, we have to analyze just what is possible in terms of the saving rate, and we have to also analyze how government transforms the fiscal revenues it receives into investment and social capital. In the area of money incomes, the critical issues are income distribution, which Professor Bettles touched on, the relationship of wage rates and so on to productivity, the intersectoral wage differences, which can generate wage rate pull in sectors that are not as productive, and of course the question of immigration. Now, Lewis also dealt with the question of business entrepreneurship in other works, basically saying that every community requires to have a cadre of persons endowed with the qualities for successful business enterprise, whether the community is capitalist, cooperative, socialist, or communist, and he details what is required for building entrepreneurial capacity, but essentially boils it down to a question of culture and the fact that third world countries do not have a long history of holding business enterprises in high regard. Now, if one were to sum up Lewis's effect on development, I would say that there were successes in his period as president of the CDB. The investment in all our countries in economic infrastructure, which he got the bank to do. Yes, I see you. I'm coming down to them. The investment in tourism development and the establishment of development banks which cater to small and medium enterprises, and the expenditures in training and education. But there's clearly less headway or less success in terms of basic macroeconomic policy, the questions of money incomes, savings and investments, employment, and foreign trade. And less success in the issue of land reform, as I have said earlier. I think we also need to still address issues of productivity and entrepreneurship. Chairman, I think I would want to stop at this point to allow time for other people.
Thank you very much, Professor Compton Bourne. Very clear and very insightful and comprehensive. We're going to take some questions at the end of the presentations. Professor Bourne, you'll be watching and waiting, and at that point we will take some questions after the other three presentations. I am going to ask our next speaker, Dr. Northover, Patricia Northover, who's a senior fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Research here at Mona, and who specializes in philosophy of economics and critical development studies, to speak to us next.
Hello, good morning, everyone. All protocols observed here this morning, and in being such august company. I think that the sentiments and coherent arguments expressed by the Vice Chancellor this morning are crucial opening remarks, and I think my paper will be consistent with those insights. So the title of my paper is Ghostly Matters, The Limits of Sir Arthur Lewis's Theory of Economic Growth. Arthur Lewis was an astute Caribbean economist, grounded in the Smithian traditions of moral philosophy and undoubtedly inspired by the heterodox Cambridge traditions from Kaleki to Keynes. He sustained a fundamental interest in understanding the dynamics of capitalist economies from the standpoint of the poor and in the interest of the racialized figure of the black body. Moreover, while he drew upon the analytical tools of classical political economy, Lewis dismisses its penchant for radical pessimism on the sustainability of capitalist progress. Rather, in his classic 1955 text, The Theory of Economic Growth, Lewis suggests not just the desirability of modern progress, as measured principally, but not exclusively, by the transition to a self-sustaining growth rate of income per capita, but also its general possibility. In particular, Lewis, by way of an appendix in his text on growth, entitled, "Is Economic Growth Desirable?", offers the proposition that modern growth could be defended because it gives man greater control over his environment and therefore increases his freedom. As an astute moral philosopher, Lewis also points out that, quote, "economic growth is only one good thing among many, and we can take it to excess." However, isn't the political fabric from which modern growth is stitched not already bedeviled with ghostly excess? And to what extent does the pursuit of modern growth accentuate general possibilities for freedom? Indeed, what are the limits to be discerned in weighing the good of growth against the other good things that should be pursued? Moreover, how far is the freedom gained from the good of growth generalized as an intrinsic good? I argue that Lewis's optimism, as necessary as it would have been for the times that he inhabited, is still haunted by a penumbra of suspicion. In particular, I wish to suggest that his faith in progress, despite its real excesses, is tarnished by the persistent presence of a colonial move, though not one of his making. That is, a sovereign or imperial will to closure and a racial politics of deletion, and relatedly abjection, that is implicated in the effort to translate the open contingency of history into the incalculability of the development plans of modern progress. My brief exposition today will be divided in two sections. I begin with a brief overview of the approach that Lewis adopted in thinking about economic growth, an approach now recognized as playing a fundamental role in catch-up growth as exemplified by East Asian and Chinese success. In section 2, I move on to raise certain questions for assessing the limits of Lewis's approach as a guide for development, a step that will require one to more directly confront the persistent power of colonial moves and addressing the ghosts haunting the violent history, that is, human identity stories of progress. Arthur Lewis, the Nobel laureate from the small and beautiful island of St. Lucia, famous for its Twin Pitons volcanic mountains, is rightfully considered to be the pioneer of the field of development economics. Writing a path-breaking essay, is this working okay? In the 1950s, Lewis was a man for the season and ahead of his times. Certainly, he was impatient with colonial mindsets and would have no intellectual affinity with their dismissive diagnoses of the economic capacity of those colonial territories and their impoverished and politically alienated subjects. Rather, he believed in the future that could be wrought from wise entrepreneurial agency in both private and public spheres, if effectively applied to the concrete problems of growth and transformation. Lewis was also ahead of his own profession that had, with the marginal revolution led by Jevons, Walras, and Menger, retreated from classical political economy to form neoclassical economics and implant the hegemony of positivism in the discipline. These developments supported a move away from the big questions of social and economic change in order to fine-tune the science of economics in the timelessness of static equilibrium models and methods. In particular, Lewis's range of interests and multidisciplinary approach was organized by his 1955 text on economic growth, which provides an analytical and interpretive framework to explore the variety of questions and problems related to the pursuit of modern growth. This analytical grid was a logically precise and coherent method for identifying the proximate and deep causes of growth. Or as he states, the inquiry into human action has to be conducted at different levels because there are proximate causes of growth as well as causes of these causes. I'm not going to read that in the interest of time. For Lewis, breadth and depth of conceptual engagement must always be complemented by a historical approach insistent on the particularities of place and openness of history. Lewis thus shunned the deterministic glosses that lingered around Marxian laws of motion, even as he promoted the use of class analysis to assess the patterns of distribution, contentions, and structural economic tendencies associated with class-based modes of capital accumulation. Lewis's approach grappled with both deep and proximate causes in a manner then that sought to engage with the issue of power while sustaining a faithfulness to the anthropological insight that cultures of life saturate human action and institutions. I now turn to my second section, the residual questions for Lewis. In opening up the economic analysis of growth to the use of historical method, attention must be carefully given to all the ways that the material of history is being produced. It will require, not only, as the astute Lewis recognized, a sensitivity to the frames of belief and meaning, but also, as Michel Rolfe-Triot argues, a sensitivity to the role of power in the production of history. To that extent, then, does Lewis productively deploy his historical method? How far is he sensitive to the terms of meaning and power that guide the production of the materials needed for his analysis of change? To briefly respond to this line of question, it is sufficient here to note that the critical precursor to Lewis's academic essays in the 1950s were his 1935 student essay on the evolution of the British West Indian peasantry, and his explosive, published 1939 monograph, Labor in the West Indies, The Birth of a Workers' Movement. These early works, alongside his multiple political and pedagogic engagements, as very well elaborated upon by Professor Mark Figueroa and others, demonstrate that Lewis was self-consciously on the side of the least well-off, the impoverished working class masses, and the small peasant, hamstrung by exploitative plantation systems to facilitate the supply of pools of unproductive surplus labor by being starved of land, capital, and knowledge. Lewis's politics, I would argue, unlike some of his critics, was less about a conservative middle-class morality, but rather more attuned to the radical side of Fabian socialist politics, as recently outlined by political theorist Tennyson Joseph, in a 2009 Social and Economic Studies article. Indeed, Lewis was unwaveringly committed to equity as a principle of justice, and relatedly to the reduction of negative inequalities caused by structural discrimination. However, as Lewis sought to explain in his 1982 W.E. Du Bois lecture on racial conflict and economic development, he believed and hypothesized that intergroup inequality based on some biological marker of race, such as color or hair texture, and or social psychology, could be and would, more or less, be properly addressed by rapid and sustained economic growth and competitive markets. He conjectured that racial conflict or the antagonistic effects of race relations that may be insidiously rooted on what Lewis believed were psychological conditions would be amenable to substantive reduction as a brisk pace of growth dismantles racial income and capital asset inequalities, ceteris paribus, which was not the case, of course. Thus, as Lewis stated, market forces work on the side of desegregation when allowed full play. In the United States since 1950, Black laborers have been moving upward towards parity with the white labor force. The disadvantaged and the subordinate have a vested interest in fast economic growth. Every reduction in the target rate for economic growth is also a reduction in the strength of equalizing forces. Lewis's optimism, as displayed in this essay, or his faith that one could expect to break the back of structurally rooted and seemingly psychologically motivated inequity, principally through the elixir of modern growth, I believe points to the Achilles heel in his struggles for development and justice for all. Faced with the complex causal yet ideal coupling of Black or racial time and proper liberty time, Lewis felt it necessary to still pursue a secular prize of a liberally framed racial justice, democracy, and a progressively lawful economic development for us all. Or as Lewis stated, I believe in the open, egalitarian, raceless society, which we do not have now, but to which most of our leaders are now committed. Unfortunately, as Dylan Rodriguez has pointed out, this objective is largely operationalized. Within modern, sorry. Have a glass of water, please. I apologize for that. Right, unfortunately, this goal, as Rodriguez has pointed out, is largely operationalized with modern historical systems as a racialized politics of deletion, which seeks to imaginatively inhabit a post-racial space on the back of an optimistically or cynically pragmatic, premature, or disingenuous politics of closure. The paradox of projects for deleting race to inaugurate a raceless society is that the deletion represents a certain kind of racial work. On the one hand, the deletion entails an ensemble of political cultural decisions that force that thing into non-visibility. On the other hand, the generalized effect of the deletion allows us to perhaps permanently avoid recognition and effective confrontation with that history of violence. Yet, as a wide-ranging studies in law, culture, politics, philosophy, economics, sociology, anthropology, on racism and the racialization of the human, social and development experience continue to testify the enigma of racial power still matters, and complexly racialized inequalities and inequities rooted on the elasticity of a color line refuse to go away. This is the case even as the death of race is announced. Okay, I'm told to wrap up. Okay, race is dead, but it refuses to rest buried. Even so, as the death of race is proclaimed by prominent black, white, black and white men in celebration of a post-racial lens societies, and despite the mass purchase of tickets for speedy carriage on the modern technologically sophisticated and time-space compressing growth train, its traffic remains one of commodities and ghosts. Yeah, I have one here. Thanks. By way of a conclusion, we live today in a haunted present. Progress has stirred, but not fundamentally shaken the power of the dead hand of race. While Lewis lived an acute awareness of the dark side of capitalism in its racism and politics of dispossession, he nonetheless was fairly convinced that wrestling within the growth logic of the same figure of modern power could generalize the promise hitherto offered only to the proper subject of liberty. While timely for the season Lewis lived in, his situated pragmatism would be subject to diminishing returns over time, given the political constraint of ghostly matters. In other words, his negotiated bargain with modern power for economic growth has its own historical political limit point, to the extent that they remain entangled in a colonial move, though one not of his making. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Northover. We're going to move very quickly to Dr. Brathwaite, who is a lecturer in the Department of Economics at Mona here, where he teaches courses in macroeconomics, economic development, international trade. His research interests would include monetary integration and development generally. I'm told to emphasize or tell you that he's a Guyanese national. I don't know why in the Caribbean setting this is not relevant. Welcome, Dr. Brathwaite.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning. You see, at this time, the Guyanese are doing well in regional cricket, so you have to put that out there. Interestingly, the opening batsman is also Guyanese. So, you know.
I was told that Guyana was part of Barbados once.
Okay, good. So there are three parts to my talk this morning. It's important that I first speak to the issue of economic development, just to contextualize where I want to situate Lewis's work. I honestly don't feel that he gets his due in terms of what we now call modern economic growth theory. To do this, I focus on his two seminal works, the 1954 paper and his 1955 book on the theory of economic growth. Ambassador Bernal is a good batsman, so opening batsman, I should say. So he's relieved me of some of the pressure of speaking to all the good things that Lewis has done. So I'll just move beyond this slide to the next one. Good. Economic development. It is important to understand what economic development is. Sometimes we see the term economic growth being used interchangeably with economic development. And traditionally, this was true and this was acceptable. But in modern economic development, a clear distinction is made between, again, economic development and economic growth. So in order for economic development to happen, you must have economic growth. But you can have economic growth and not have economic development. So for the remainder of this presentation, when I speak to Lewis's work on economic growth, I'm using economic development interchangeably with economic growth. Speaking about economic development, it's good to understand the human side of it. That is, the three goals we speak of: basic sustenance, so you must have shelter, you must have food; self-esteem, so a good education, you must be healthy; and freedom from servitude. So you can think of being able to write a letter to the press and not being worried that someone will come and knock on your door and take you away. All of these things constitute economic development. It's just not simply about an increase in the capacity of a country to produce goods and services. Yes? So when you look at Lewis's work, especially his book, The Theory of Economic Growth, you see this human side, the side which looks beyond output. It's clearly there in his work on economic growth. The other point I wish to make relates more towards the development of economic growth over time. Economic growth theory, I should say, over time. So one of the questions I would ask students in macroeconomic theory is simply this. What accounts for the vast differences in economic growth or output per person across space and time? That's a simple question we seek to answer. In the 1950s, when you go back to the solo growth model, for example, a lot of time is spent on capital accumulation. And I must be clear here, by capital, I really should have written, my apologies, I didn't realize that. Could we go back to this slide on economic development, please? Yes, thank you. Sorry, the previous one. Good, that's fine, thank you. Okay. Down. Yes, so physical accumulation of capital was the focus for those early theories of economic growth. But what was found was that physical capital accumulation was insufficient to answer the question as to what accounts for the vast differences in economic growth across space and time. In the 80s, economists like Romer argued for technological accumulation, human capital accumulation, as the answer to explain, why we have these vast differences in economic growth, in output per person across space and time. But technological accumulation was not sufficient to explain, while it was good at explaining differences across time, it still left unanswered or didn't offer a sufficient explanation as to why some countries were moving faster than others. In recent times, economists like Asimoglu and Robinson focus more on the issue of institutions. And so the story I'm trying to tell today is that we haven't given enough credit to Lewis for actually saying what modern growth theorists have been saying in the sense of the importance of technological advancement, human capital accumulation, and the importance of institutions. Yes? So that is the case, that is the story I wish to tell. So Lewis's seminal paper for which he won the Nobel Prize, Economic Development with Unlimited Supplies of Labor, my view is that in this paper he spends a lot of time, well, I shouldn't say a lot of time, but he does place emphasis on the importance of technological advancement. But when you look at how it's interpreted, little or no emphasis is placed on that. In fact, when I think of Lewis's work, I think of a painter who does an abstract painting. And someone comes, they stand in front of the painting and they interpret it a certain way. And Lewis was fine with that, I think any painter would be fine with someone looking at their work and going away with something other than the painter intended. That's fine. But we must also recognize, too, what the painter was trying to say. So Lewis spent a lot of time trying to correct some of the misconceptions surrounding his work, even as early as a few years after the 1954 paper. You see? To give you an example, some years ago when I first started teaching economic development, I was using a textbook. At that time, I hadn't really interrogated Lewis's 54 paper. And I thought to myself, I said, the way the author looks at Lewis misses the point that a poor farmer could get some seed from the wealthy capitalist farmer, some high-yielding seed that he could use his seed and, he can now become more efficient. And guess what? When I actually read Lewis's 54 paper, he actually mentions that very example of the seed. So this is to say, too, that Lewis's work, it's very, very accessible, it transcends time. Yeah? So just to go through my slide. So the purpose of that essay was to speak towards solving problems of distribution, accumulation, and growth. More importantly, we cannot explain any industrial revolution until we can explain why saving increased relatively to national income. So I wanted to underscore here the importance of saving, and we heard that being said earlier. In fact, I must say, though, that in the case of the Caribbean, it may not only be an issue of the amount we save, but what we do with the savings. If you look around Kingston, you see a lot of car dealerships, right? That explains where a lot of the savings actually go instead of productive, more productive uses. But that's for another session. Fourth, this is also why industrial and agrarian revolutions always go together, and why economies in which agriculture is stagnant do not show industrial development. This last point is also important because one of the misconceptions was that Lewis was saying move away from agriculture. No. What is needed is advancement also in agriculture, technological advancement. In terms of the central problem of economic development, he says, it is to understand the process by which a community which was previously saving and investing 4 or 5% of its national income or less converts itself into an economy where voluntary saving is running at about 12 to 15% of national income or more. This is the central problem because the central fact of economic development is rapid capital accumulation. And here's the punchline: including knowledge and skills with capital. So this fixation on physical capital, in my view, was a misconception of what Lewis was looking at, and it has led, I think, growth theorists to really miss a very strong aspect of what he was doing. And again, I could understand why this was so given the focus in the 1950s and so on physical capital accumulation. Yes? But again, Lewis was ahead of his time. To bring home the point of his emphasis on technological advancement, there are several quotes which I pulled from his paper, because one of the things I try to do is not just to say what I think he's saying, but to actually bring the quotes. So you can't say, well, I'm reading between the lines. He actually said these things. Time doesn't permit me to go into too much detail, but just to say, let me read the first excerpt I have up there. In any case, for the purpose of this analysis, it is unnecessary to distinguish between capital formation and the growth of knowledge within the capitalist sector. Growth of technical knowledge outside the capitalist sector would be fundamentally important, since it would raise the level of wages and so reduce the capitalist sector surplus. But inside the capitalist sector, knowledge and capital work in the same direction to raise the surplus and to increase employment. So clearly here, when he speaks about capital accumulation, he is speaking to knowledge accumulation. He's speaking to education too. But of course, the interpreters of his work had their own agenda. Moving on. Capital and technical knowledge also work together in the sense that in economies where techniques are stagnant, savings are not so readily applied to increasing productive capital. In such economies, it is more usual to use savings for building pyramids, churches, and other such durable consumer goods. No offense to Christians. The subsistence sector may also become more productive in the technical sense, and this is the argument for the technical advancement of agriculture. For example, it may begin to imitate the techniques of the capitalist sector the peasants may get hold of some of the new seeds or hear about the new fertilizers or rotations, crop rotations. So here again, as the point I was making earlier about Lewis viewing, advancement of the agricultural sector as crucial for development too. And even when we think of subsistence agriculture, it too can benefit from technological advancement. Moving on now to the theory of economic growth, and here is where I just want to make the point again that when Lewis speaks about growth and development, he sees the human side of it. The advantage of economic growth is not that wealth increases happiness, but that it increases the range of human choice. Moving on. The case for economic growth is that it gives man greater control over his environment and thereby increases his freedom. 3, for it is then necessary to transform belief, habits, and institutions. Finally, in the present context, our problem is not the appropriate rate of growth of output, but rather the appropriate length of the period of transition from one pattern of social attitudes and institutions to another. So we see how Lewis comes full circle. So when we trace the development of economic theory, economic growth theory, and we see where there was this move from just simply capital accumulation to focus on technological advancement, and then to also say, well, look, we can have technological advancement, we can have this spillover of technologies from one country, from the developed countries to other countries, but if we don't have the institutional changes in developing countries, those technologies would go to naught. One more point. I know the next panel will deal with the continued relevance of Lewis. But when we think of what he says in the theory of economic growth in terms of man and his environment, we live in a time when, over the last 4 decades or so, we've seen the rapid explosion in terms of trade. And we've seen the explosion, too, of information technology and, so the quick movement of information across space. This is important in that we have people who are anxious to say, well, look, why can't we have what they have? So when we look to the United States and we see Barack Obama coming to the presidency and even Trump, and we see Brexit, these are all reactions to things which have happened within the last 4 decades or so. And people are reacting to that changed environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brathwaite. The next speaker is Professor Mark Figueroa. It's my great pleasure. He was one of my first teachers, as I said earlier, when I came to Mona. I'm being told that Professor Figueroa has retired. I can't see how that's possible from the university, from Mona. He has worked in the Department of Economics as long as I can recall economics as a discipline here. And he later went to SALISES. But now he's currently the Honorary Research Fellow at the UWI Museum and Archives. His present focus is on the collaboration of oral histories, but he continues to do work on Lewis's work, which has been a main focus of his for quite a long time, and he has written some 10 papers in this area. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Figueroa.
My focus today is on ideas, not so much as a contribution, but as a potential contribution. Many people believe they honor Lewis by suggesting that he made a major contribution to Caribbean development. In contrast, I believe we dishonor him when we overemphasize his contribution, rather than indicate how much more could have been achieved if his approach to development had been adopted. Not getting any joy here.
Pointed towards. ensure you point it out.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Okay. In my presentation, I start with my main conclusions, and I look at Lewis's contribution to development, speak to ways he actually contributed, as I am on this panel, which was supposed to look at his contribution, but I focus more on the potential of his ideas. So I look at his Caribbean, as well as his global diagnoses, his perspective on development, his methodology, and to illustrate my point of what his potential for contribution is, I look at Lewis and the contemporary economy. Go back one, please. Please go back one. Okay. As we know, Lewis made many contributions to developments. He contributed in many countries and over a long period of time. Some of the activities which I'll mention. Importantly, as other colleagues have intimated, his economic ideas have been vindicated by the East Asian development successes. Unfortunately, I've not been able to see any study which seeks to understand the degree to which these were actually influenced by his ideas. As a result, I have to conclude that despite the foregoing, compared to what was possible, the direct impact of his particular economic approach was minor, especially in the Caribbean. As such, my main conclusion is that his ideas remain an untapped resource for Caribbean development. Change it for me, please. Lewis's contribution can be seen in three parts. Three struggles. He struggled with the colonialists and the neocolonialists against the prevailing racism and the related views, re the limited possibilities of the peoples of the tropics, as he liked to speak. He struggled with his own peoples to have them grasp a broader vision for themselves and to take action to realize their potential. And he struggled with his colleagues against prevailing dogma and a dogmatic approach to economics. To illustrate this point, I use the case of reparations, to which the Vice Chancellor mentioned, that Lewis already in 1938 said that Britain had a debt that it was yet to pay. But what was important about Lewis and his approach to development is that he told the UK, you need to pay your debt. He went further, which is so evident today, that the development of poor countries is in the interest of the development of rich countries, and the consequences of the failure to deal with the development of poor countries has a negative impact on the developed world. But Lewis made a very other important point. He turned his face away from the developed countries and he turned his face to his own people. And he said, even if Britain doesn't pay its debt, you have the capacity to develop, and you must develop, and don't expect to get anything from them, and you can still develop on your own. And that is very important. You could change the slide for me. He contributed in three ways. First of all, through his own path-breaking career, which was an example which demonstrated, in many ways, the lie to racism. And I need to correct the Vice Chancellor, which is dangerous when you're still an honorary fellow. He said, no, it's not the Vice Chancellor, the Pro-Vice Chancellor. Sorry, Vice Chancellor. He said, immediately after completing his degree, he was so good, he was given a job at LSE. That's not true at all. He was given a job at LSE because LSE was embarrassed. He applied for a job as a clerk in Port of Spain, and for racial reasons he didn't get it. He applied to The Economist because he wanted to be a journalist. And The Economist said, you might have to interview people who are not comfortable with you. And they didn't. And the London School of Economics was so embarrassed that their best student couldn't get a job that they employed him. So that as Pat has emphasized, sometimes we forget, first of all, the history of racism and what Lewis was struggling against, and the extent to which racism has not been, is still a ghost that haunts us, to use her words. So there's also his social activism, and can you go to the next slide? I just give you an idea of the range of his activism through the flags that represent the countries, regions, and institutions which Lewis was engaged with. Can you go back for me? Go back? Yes. So his institutional, political, and social activism. And thirdly, we have his ideas on which I want to focus. Could we go to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Okay. So briefly, his diagnosis, which I don't want to focus on, but I'm not managing my time very well. He says that the failure of Caribbean development was a failure to transform in relation to the changing global environment. That is what it was. It wasn't due to our race, it wasn't due to anything we lacked, but it was a failure of the social system. Hence, many people remained engaged in low-wage employment or were unemployed. And thirdly, this was due, as I've said, to the failure of the social system, and in particular, leadership. Next slide, please. In his global analysis, poor countries were poor, would remain poor, so long as they exchanged multiple units of their labor for single units of labor of the people of the developed countries. It was a transformation of the productivity of labor within the national economy, which was the basis for the transformation of the position of countries in the world economy. Hence, you can't make your country rich by impoverishing your people. Next one, please. Okay, so where did Lewis stand in development? We've already seen from other speakers, he stood on the side of the poor. It was for the benefit of the majority. But a lot of different aspects of Lewis have been mentioned, but the general approach of Lewis is what I present here. How do you bring about development? Through dialogue, consensus, cohesion, partnership. Without those, you don't get development, as the Caribbean demonstrates. Also, as the Caribbean demonstrates, if you don't have restraint and sacrifice, you don't get development. What does it require? Leadership, which has failed us. Perhaps we got the leadership we deserved. Visioning, planning, education, training, and apprenticeship, in the sense that he said that the local capitalist class need to be apprenticed, or managers need to be apprenticed. We need to send people abroad to work and understand we need them to bring them back and so forth. And we need to bring people from abroad to help us, as well as we need to go abroad and understand what is happening. This is based on 1, confidence in self, and 2, an understanding of our position in the global economy. Making, as his mother taught him, the best use of what we have, and arriving at the most advantageous compromises and trade-offs. So that I take this from Lewis and look at the contemporary economy, next slide please, to say I forgot about this slide. I have his methodology, which I should just mention. As a result of that, he was critical he took a critical approach to society and to received theory. Comparative. You can't understand where you are unless you compare to other persons. A lot of people believe certain things are special about us. They're not special about us at all, because when you look at other cases, you see it. multidisciplinary, as one colleague mentioned, eclectic and pragmatic and not dogmatic. Someone else mentioned the historical, institutional, and the dynamic. And the pedagogical aspect is very important because you have to teach people about the economy. All right, now I come to the part which next slide, please. Okay, this talk is not sponsored by Juicy Patties, but this is my vision of what I would like to see the headquarters of Caribbean enterprises in the developed world. Right? That's what Juicy Patties should look like in Toronto and New York. Right? And this is the vision that Lewis had. There's a lot of nonsense about foreign direct investment. You can't get rich with foreign direct investment unless you have as much foreign direct investment abroad as there's foreign direct investment in your country. And this was his vision. So that, first of all, we need to situate our economy within the global dynamics. Secondly, we need to understand Caribbean people's preferences. And Lewis had two sides to this. One is you need to struggle against some of their preferences, but you have to face it. You can't defeat all the Caribbean people's preferences, so you have to work with them. We need to grasp the geographies of the Caribbean people. Caribbean people don't only live in the Caribbean, right? If you look at the geographies of someone like our Vice Chancellor, you see he's in and out of Britain, he's in and out of Barbados. I think he currently lives somewhere in the Caribbean. It's not clear where, right? That's the nature of the Caribbean peoples, right? It means we have to engage the diaspora, and we need to engage migratory circulation, which is essential to what it means to be Caribbean. This allows us to spread products from the Caribbean to the developed world through the Caribbean diaspora, hence my patty example. People think development is having Burger King in Jamaica, right? But we should be earning far more from franchising our products abroad than they earn from franchising in this small market. The other thing related to that is we need to create Caribbean affinities through tourism. We have this crazy Caribbean tourism product now, which is American in the Caribbean. Why is the United States such a powerful power? It's not because it's not their military, it's not their economy, but is there a sense in which we are all Americans? I don't watch TV, but you guys watch American TV, right? We are a cultural power in the Caribbean, and we need to use that cultural power to develop us. Jamaica gets, I don't know how many million visitors a year, but when they come here, they don't become Caribbean people, right? They come and have a tropical American experience. If all these visitors came to the Caribbean and became Caribbean people, think of all the music, the fashions, the food, all the other things that these people could purchase, which could be developed if we won them to be in Caribbean. Tells me my time is up. The last point is that requires maximizing the national resource use and linkages so that the agricultural sector is linked to the tourist sector, but also your fashion industry, your music industry, your culture, everything you develop can be linked through this process of building Caribbean infinities and the connection between the Caribbean as a super cultural power in the global work. And I didn't mention sports, VC.
Thank you very much, Professor Figueroa, who was our last speaker. We're going to take some questions, but I'll use my privilege as chairman to just pose one issue. We cannot be prosperous using only our domestic market. I think most economists, including Sir Arthur Lewis, came to that conclusion. We have to export, we have to engage the rest of the world. How can a country capture a significantly larger share of the world's trading in manufacturing and agriculture in a short time? That was one of the questions that he explored extensively in the 1950s and 60s by looking at Great Britain and India compared to Germany and the United States. And he had a very simple view that the how was very easy. How to do so was to produce goods that had what he called keen prices. Flood the world with salesmen. Have large-scale selling organizations around the world for juicy beef and juicy patties and what have you. Pay attention to customers' wishes, the needs and desires and tastes of the Caribbean people, as Professor Figueroa puts it. But very importantly, liberal credit arrangements, capital being available to allow this. These were his 5, what he called easy elements. But he said economists spoke mainly of just pricing, just a price element. But businessmen, who are really the ones who export, not governments, not academia, not people from academia or public service, we are the ones who pay most attention to just this one element of price. But you have to sell, you have to market, you have to have a good product, and you have to pay attention to what the market desires. So, when he came to answer the bigger question as to how, how do you do it, actually, and what is required, he identified 2 elements which he considered to be unsatisfactory. One, you have to have momentum. So you have to be doing this, exporting, and continue the momentum. But finally, he said you needed the desire, this great urge and desire by the business class to want to export and to want to invest. If you didn't have that, then you would not be successful. My question to the panel and the panelists, are the issues, or were the issues raised by Sir Arthur Lewis in terms of the trade theory, the development model, moving from stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and into stage 4, in terms of export of basic material, subsistence agricultural output, manufactured goods coming to us through industrialization by invitation model, the import substitution model, and once you've exhausted that, getting to another phase of export agriculture, doing all the things that we need to do. Professor Figueroa is of the view that we didn't follow the model sufficiently, and therefore we didn't succeed. But given where we are today in the global economy, in terms of the other challenges and the nature of the geopolitical realities that we face, is the model, are the ideas of Sir Arthur Lewis still relevant to take us to the next level of development? With my single question, I then ask the floor to ask some questions, and you cannot emulate me. I have privilege.
Let me commend the panelists. I thought the presentations were all excellent. The Vice Chancellor provided a useful context in terms of the era in which Lewis developed his model. I want to ask the panel 2 particular questions, but allow me to phrase it in a particular way. When I was here in the Faculty of Social Sciences, the dominant conversation was to demonstrate that Lewis's model was inappropriate and couldn't work. Lewis was a casualty of the intellectual ideological polarization that existed at that time. And I think it's useful that Mark suggested that if the Lewis model had been given a chance to work, if instead of tearing it down, we had embraced it and put it to work, I'm sure that today that intellect would have come up with a completely different model. Because at the time when he did his work, the plantation industries were still alive, even if not as well as they used to be. Globalization was something that I don't think the word had yet been coined. But Mark also referred to the impact that it had on East Asian development. And the question that I would like to ask, two questions. Are we prepared today to accept that the demolition of Lewis at the time was inappropriate and premature, and that it constitutes a missed opportunity? And secondly, could Mark in particular elaborate on the relevance of Lewis's model to what has happened in Singapore and perhaps to a lesser extent in Taiwan and more recently in some of the other East Asian countries?
Could you identify yourself?
Morning. My name is Helen and Wilkinson. Just to congratulate SALISES. I think the greatest honor has been having a physical building that accommodates people to go and do research. And it's always impeccably kept. And the facilities are really good in terms of research. And I'd like to suggest that as a continuing honor, perhaps expanding the computer lab and those things to a 24/7 facility so that you can pull in many of the intellectual strengths. A lot of us here are what we call conferencers. We go to all the conferences. But a lot of us are also graduates of the university, alumni. And all of that capital could be pooled into SALISES for more research. You say you didn't want a speech, but just quickly. As somebody would said, I heard in a JPS line, and they were watching the budget debate, and they said that, look here, no matter what they say, we have to find the money to pay the light bill. Therefore, the Caribbean governments have said that 66% of our students have less than 1 or 2 CXC subjects. How can SALISES, the governments, curb that tendency? Because when we have all these gangs, it means that people have gone to find self-esteem elsewhere. And how can we then, because then that then spins off what he spoke about, the institutionalized, systemic institutional failures. So how can we look to immediately address that? Professor Don Robotham last year gave a lecture about crime in Jamaica, and he said there was a problem with ruthlessness, R-O-O-T, the root, without the link between agriculture. And we have not then acted on that. And now we have a state of emergency in Montego Bay. We need to then go immediately, how we can speed up that process to go and do something about it immediately, which is get agriculture growing. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Olayinka Jacobs-Wanick. I would like for Professor Figueroa to elaborate on the relevance between Sir Arthur Lewis's economic framework and cultural Caribbean power. It remains our greatest untapped resource, and we are well known as a crucible for rapid innovation within that sector. So I'd like to have a better understanding of that. Thank you.
Response.
My name is Mark Ricketts. I'd like to follow up on the former Prime Minister's question in terms of the extent to which we discounted during our time Sir Arthur Lewis. I thought when I read him at that stage that he was the most brilliant West Indian. And I was so disappointed that I had to be fighting with my lecturers, G. Beck, Norman, Gervin, Jefferson, etc., in terms of how much we constrained the student body I left, I came back after 10 years, and it's still the same. And I've come back after 50 years, and it's still the same. I would like to find out, at what point are we going to challenge the student body to think entrepreneurial? Look at this university. Tell me how many Jamaicans out of this university have started a major corporation. How many Jamaicans are what you call, if you want to call it, your traditional capitalist? Where are we leading the country in terms of possibility? Are we still going to be asking the same question in 30, 40 years' time in terms of slavery, colonialism, the extent to which we don't have a capacity as individuals to break through? So I think, in a way, we have really had a sad sort of review of Sir Arthur Lewis. And I wish, and I suppose Mark probably brought up some of those things in terms of his ideas, if we had just probably given them a chance, so that today this university could have been a clear statement to the rest of society as regards what the potential was. The last point I'd just like to finish with is, if you look at our educational system, we missed almost everything that was required for development in Jamaica. Examine it. Wood and water, where are we? We have nothing. Our agriculture, 200,000 people in agriculture, we never develop a capacity for capital output ratios to deal with that as a significant advance and as linkages. So I know it's more a statement, but I think, just as I said, following up on Bruce's question, to throw
ask your question.
No, I think Bruce really asked the question. Okay. I just wanted to add some things.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I think that to take the question about culture and Lewis, right? Lewis said that his mother taught him to make do with what he had, and that is what he had done, right? I see that as one of the two basic elements of the Lewis model. The other one is that his mother taught him anything they can do, we can do. So those are the two elements of the Lewis model as far as I am concerned. And they are the responsibility of Ida Lewis, okay? When you look at the Caribbean and you say, what do we have? We're a cultural power. And therefore it is Louisian to say that we should use our cultural power to develop our region, right? So that is the connection that I make. People speak about the Lewis model and so forth. I don't see the Lewis model in terms of any specific recommendations or so forth, but rather in an approach to development. Because you can't expect what Lewis said 70 years ago or more to be specifically relevant in terms of a policy sense. Okay, so I've answered that. The other question that was asked was about education, and I don't think we have a time to go into education, but certainly Lewis favored a very different kind of education system than we have. One that was skills-based. He criticized Jamaica, particularly in the 50s, compared to even Trinidad, Barbados, and Puerto Rico in terms of the extent to which TechVoc, somebody mentioned TechVoc. But it then comes back to what Mark Ricketts and Bruce Golden are asking and speaking about and so forth. You see, Mark, we do have to talk about slavery, as the Vice Chancellor will tell us, and we do have to talk about our social history and so forth, and we do have to understand it, and we do have to understand our preferences. Caribbean people have a preference for professional jobs, to be independent professionals. Now, if you know that people want to be nurses, right, then you need to think, can we train people to be nurses who are going to go abroad and support our countries? What is Jamaica's largest industry? Anybody can tell me? What? Working abroad. Working abroad. That's our largest industry. So we need to understand our proclivities. At the same time, in understanding our history, we need to struggle against it to see how we can encourage our people to develop into being capitalists. Lewis said, you can't have a developed country unless you develop a capitalist class. Now, for those of us who were steeped in the socialist tradition, we wanted to develop the capitalist class, as Lewis suggested, within the state sector. It didn't work out like that. But whether you develop the capitalist class in the state sector or you develop the capitalist class in the commercial sector, then you have to develop a capitalist class. You have to develop an entrepreneurial class. And entrepreneurship is not just about making money. You need entrepreneurs in the university, you need entrepreneurs in the public sector, and so forth. So that, but at the same time, I believe that Lewis's ideas were not fully understood. I don't think they're even fully understood today, and I have wasted my career trying to get people to understand it as I see it. Maybe I'm the one who don't understand it. But it's a misunderstanding also to pose a dichotomy between Lewis and Beckford. For example, I've written a paper, which I must send you, Mark, in which I discuss the Beckford-Lewis model. Because people still talk about Lewis, about the transfer from industry, from agriculture to industry. But what Beckford and Lewis were talking about was developing the agricultural sector as the foundation of the economy by a process of agrarian reform. So Lewis and Beckford were ad idem on agrarian reform. Now, where there was a difference of opinion, and I think to some extent it is one of emphasis and a lack of dialogue, because Lewis and Beckford and all of them could have dialogued more, I believe. But it has to the question of the role of foreign capital, right? Now, up to this day, there are people who are saying that we must develop through foreign direct, what do they call it? FDI, foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment cannot develop your country. Lewis said, we're already, in the article that Compton mentioned, they said we're already too dependent on foreign capital. But it's a nuance point. Foreign capital, foreign direct investment can play a very important role in developing your country. But only if it leads to the development of a national capitalist class. Only if there's a transfer of skills. So what Lewis said, for example, in his 1953 lecture in Cairo, was that the most important regulation is the work permit regulations. Right? That is, you must make sure that foreign capitalists must employ locals and not just in minor positions. Now, the critique that the New World people had of him is that Lewis didn't understand the nature of foreign capital and that the decisions are not taken here even when the enterprise is here. So you might be the general manager of Alcoa in Jamaica or the general manager of Scotiabank in Jamaica, but you're not taking one decision, right? So that there's enormous insight from the New World thinkers and an enormous insight from Lewis. And my feeling is that if we can bring about that dialogue and understand the insights from these two schools, then we would be able to, through a process of dialogue, consensus, partnership, and all these other things that Lewis stood for. And of course, sacrifice, right? I won't say what he said about the middle class and some of us as we continue today. Okay. But that is how I put it all together.
Questions. Is the development model still relevant? Is Lewis a political scapegoat? And what do we do about the youth? That's what I distilled from the questions. In terms of the first question about the relevance of development model, I would say basically his development approach is still relevant. I think that Lewis certainly maximized his academic interest by publishing in prestigious journals and pushing a particular way of thinking, which was within the academy. But his broader approach goes way beyond the models that he presented. His theory of economic growth really helps that, and the works that complemented that. He had 3 dimensions, which was the decolonial, democratization or empowerment, and development. And I think we still need those 3 dimensions. I think we need basically to take Lewis and jump and leapfrog into the future. We can't do catch-up anymore because the world has changed. We have unprecedented levels of inequality and poverty, unprecedented levels of vulnerability and insecurity, unprecedented levels of violence, and what Du Bois called entombment. So I think we need to realize, just like Lewis realized, the context and understand that we need appropriate tools for the task at hand. And in this regard, I want to welcome you all to a conference that we're going to host in April, Envisioning Caribbean Futures, which will take place in Montego Bay. So it's still relevant, but it's really the approach that is relevant, and we need to have 3-fold dimension. So he was a scapegoat, but I think it was a necessary kind of dialectic within the region because different people saw different issues that needed to be put to the front burner. And I think where Lewis was perhaps weakest was, to some extent, not understanding the depth of the political problem that he was grappling with. And I think that has faced all Black academics, Du Bois, Garvey, Lewis, where you start grappling with a problem, but you don't realize, shit, this thing goes deep, right? So, and I think those political currents that we had in the Caribbean were necessary because it did go deep.
Thank you very much. One last comment.
Just
quickly.
Yes,
one. Vice Chancellor.
Less than a minute. There's one point that I forgot to make, which I think is very important when speaking about Lewis. You have to distinguish between the Lewis model and the Lewis strategy. The Lewis model, which I spent time speaking to, in terms of economic growth theory, is very broad and very flexible, can be applied, as I see it, to any situation. When you look at Lewis's 1950 article on the industrialization of the British West Indies, that is the Lewis strategy for Caribbean development. So I think when you read of this pushback against Lewis in terms of his recommendations for the Caribbean and the moniker industrialization by invitation, it's speaking about the Lewis strategy, what was said in the 1950 article. Yes? Just to clarify. Okay.
Just before the Vice Chancellor comes up, I want to thank the panelists, and I want you to give them a round of applause. Really appreciate it. And it leaves me nothing else to do but to invite the Vice Chancellor to say a few words of closure.
Just to say, panelists, colleagues, and friends, that we are going to return to this. This is too very important. When the IMF director made reference to economic growth resistance in the Caribbean, it became obvious to us that this is a crossroads. We need to work through this post-IMF Caribbean development strategy. It's been 30 years. We need to work beyond that. We need to bring our economists back to the table to integrate these conversations, and we need to start again. I respect very much the point made by Mr. Ricketts. Has he gone? He's still there? Yeah, he's there. I used to be a subscriber to your magazine, The Money Index, and I still have all of them from the 80s when you discussed these matters. I can loan you mine. I still, and of course, Prime Minister Bruce Golden, who spoke about this. There are 2 issues I wish to comment on as to why we must return to this. As an economic historian broadly, we are looking for competitiveness. We could say this is a 3rd phase in the Caribbean economy, and we are stuck. We could say that the first phase was really the plantation economy, where we had price competitiveness for most of it with the sugar product and the related coffee and so on. So we had a 200-year period of price competitiveness, and we were able to generate the wealth. We didn't enjoy the wealth, but the wealth was generated. Then the second phase, I think, starting from the 1940s, Second World War, when we move into services, and then, of course, finance, offshore finance, tourism. And again, we were competitive, not only at the level of pricing, but at the level of quality. So we got a bounce in our economies from the 60s, 70s, 80s, with the tourism sector, with the finance. It gave us a boost because we had a product that was of quality. The quality of that product seemed to be diminishing, and we are in difficulty. We're being pushed back in the offshore financial sectors. So now this is the phase of development that is driven by innovation. This is the third phase. This is the innovation phase in all the economies in the world. And that innovation is driven by research, is driven by high-level intensity thought, and it is coming out of the universities. It's coming out of the research laboratories of the private sector, and it's coming out of the colleges and universities in the world. And this is where we're at now, and there is going to be no economic growth, no economic transformation until we frame the discourse around innovation. And this is the point that Mark is making, because one of the areas that is pregnant for that innovation is culture and identity. And this is an area where the innovation and the new industries have to pick up, whether it's sport, entertainment, theater, all of those issues. So this is the time for the university. The Southeast Asian model of which we spoke, that model was built upon the innovation coming out of universities and the technical laboratories of the private sector. This is the university's time. This is our time. But we need to have a conversation with the state, with the private sector, and the universities to frame all of this, to bring all of this together so that we don't miss these opportunities. The state has the resources, the public resources, the private sector has considerable resources, and we have a strong intellectual class in the Caribbean. This is our time. This is a moment. So I believe Lewis had imagined all of that. I think Lewis had imagined all of that. And my final point on Lewis, let me tell you what he used to say when I walked across the Cayfield campus with him. He used to say, in the humanities, there's a school of literature called Writers in Exile, where these Caribbean writers were saying, I cannot think in the Caribbean, I have to leave. And off they went to London to become writers in exile. And there's a whole literature, a whole genre about these scholars and these writers in exile. And he would say to me, I am not going to be an economist in exile. Came back to the Caribbean and began the practice of economic growth, the practice of it. And that is where we're at now, the practice of it through innovation, research, and the alignment of our imaginations to capital. This is where we are. So, Prime Minister Golden, with all of your influence, we need to bring the states of the Caribbean, the private sectors of the Caribbean, and the university communities of the Caribbean now to look at the application of all of this to economic transformation in the age of innovation. And this is why this conversation has to go on and on and on until we get it right. Thank you all very much for being a part of this.